I think that you were given other references, but just if you want to read up more about what I'm talking about right now, I have an article, I have a special report that was written for the U.S. Institute for Peace. It came out in May of 2012, and it's moving forward with the legal empowerment of women in Pakistan. And I've been documenting Pakistani state policy towards women. I feel like since forever. I was part of the initial Women's Action Forums protests even in Lahore in the early 1980s. And I have followed things very closely over all these years. I'm about to leave for Pakistan in the beginning of January. I'll be running for the second time a doctoral dissertation workshop for doctoral students in Pakistan researching gender issues, women and gender issues in Pakistan. And I'm the only non-Pakistani who's a member, I'm a member of the Research Advisory Board of the National Commission on the Status of Women, which I feel quite honored to have been asked to be a part of that, because it's a recognition and an acknowledgement on the part of my Pakistani colleagues that the research that I've done on women and gender issues in Pakistan is something that can be beneficial to them too. So today, it's kind of an awkward title, but I was given the title, Women in Pakistan in Statehood, and I interpreted that as meaning, so what has happened to women from state policies, basically. So without any further ado, I will begin. The concept of women's rights, including women's economic and political participation, elicits disparate conflicting images in contemporary Pakistan. What constitutes these rights, who defines them, and where responsibility lies for ensuring them is highly contested. And there appears to be little room for compromise amongst the various contending sides. To some extent, the tension has existed since Pakistan's founding, but the past few decades have seen the disagreements destabilize Pakistan's political and social cohesiveness, something that I often refer to as the culture wars that are dividing Pakistan. Pakistan persists as an amalgamation of often contradictory political enterprises with two cohesive strands articulating divergent views on the rights of women, and also rhetoric to incorporate more laws and institutions derived from Islam. While there are a variety of contextual arenas within which the political, social, and economic empowerment of women in Pakistan can be considered, I think that none can be really more critical than law. The history of laws affecting women's rights and empowerment in Pakistan involves a complex pattern of advances and setbacks, with the state's efforts to articulate a definition of women's rights complicated by the need to balance divergent views on the place of women in Pakistani society. How women's legal rights are framed, though, is fundamental to considering how best to advance women's empowerment, how to enable women to participate in the political system and have an effective voice in that system. What has been achieved thus far in Pakistan has had a qualitative impact on moving forward with the empowerment of women, although there are far more arenas that must now be incorporated and mechanisms set up to ensure the implementation of these laws so as to have a substantive effect on women's lives, impact all classes of women in the country, and secure an environment where women in Pakistan have access to viable choices in their lives. In the pessimism that far too often embroils those of us who research prospects for women's rights in Pakistan, it is incumbent on us not to lose sight of the signposts of achievements and passage of the Muslim Families Laws Ordinance 50 years ago, rather 51 years ago, was certainly a watershed point in this process. Indeed, not only its passage, but also its endurance for a half century. Mind you, there have been many people and groups who have sworn to overturn it these past 5 decades, but its endurance is both symbolic and has a practical importance for women's rights and women's empowerment in Pakistan. We can trace the most compelling arenas affecting women's legal rights in Pakistan today back to passage of the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance in 1961, developing and implementing legislation affecting women's general rights as citizens and family members, ensuring women's safety as they enter public domains, and efforts to ensure women's agency, meaning women's movement. Women can do things, right? Certainly, implementation of such laws is also compelling, but implementation only becomes a concern once the laws actually exist. And it was passage of the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance, both practically and symbolically, that set the legal empowerment of women in motion 51 years ago in Pakistan. Now, the quandary over ensuring women's rights in Pakistan is closely tied to the need for a consensus that women in Pakistan have a right, or in the words of Moroccan sociologist Fatima Mernissi, I love this quote of hers, to design a future instead of just growing old. Sorry. Sometimes this may mean that specific rights we presume women enjoy in Pakistan because they are consistent with Islamic Sharia, such as retaining inherited land in their own names or divorcing abusive husbands. This is all consistent with Islam. We assume these laws actually exist, or these rights actually exist, or that new rights need to be enshrined to rectify abuses which have existed in traditional society, such as outlawing swada and karo kari. I'll explain later. Domestic and public violence, and other practices which cause women to bear the consequences for wrongs committed by others. Ensuring rights is only possible when they are supported by laws and policies that enshrine and enforce them, hence the importance of interrogating Pakistan's legal framework when we're addressing women's political rights in the country. I'm positing how Pakistan is grappling with the construction of what can be termed gendered modernity, a compelling social dilemma as the country becomes increasingly urban, with greater numbers of educated women, many of whom are no longer willing to tolerate discriminatory social practices and laws. At the same time, conservative groups aggressively promote seemingly irreconcilable stances on women's rights. And I guess I should mention there's an edited book that came out about 2 years ago, edited by Stephen Cohen and others, called Pakistan's Future. And I have an article about that. What does Pakistan's future hold? Because now there's such a large, even though the percentage is not that much greater, but there's just such greater numbers of educated women. And how is that going to affect political and economic dynamics? So just to give you a bit of historical backdrop, which I thought was relevant since we were being asked to talk about the history of this all as well. At the founding of the new country in 1947, there was little legal distinction between the rights women enjoyed and the rights enjoyed by men in Pakistan, consistent with the larger contours of the state's project to ensure the country's existence in the decade following partition, which is what I talked about this morning. Ideological concerns, such as those which rose to prominence in the 1970s and 1980s, I was talking about Zia-ul-Haq's Islamization program, those types of ideological concerns were a luxury at the outset that Pakistan could not afford in the 1950s when faced with the stark reality of threats to its survival. And again, I talked about those threats became real in 1971 when Bangladesh seceded and was supported by India in that effort. In Pakistan's quest to become, to become a recognized member of the global community of nations, the state stepped forward and became a party to a number of UN human rights instruments. One of the first of these was the 1953 Convention on the Political Rights of Women. A few years later, when faced with the decision of whether it would ratify the UN Convention on the Consent to Marriage, minimum age for marriage and registration of marriage. This was a UN initiative in the late 1950s. It was President Ayub Khan's government that saw this as an unprecedented opportunity to modify Pakistan's legal framework and move forward and modernize the country. As the task at hand was how to ensure women's rights within the family, here was an unprecedented opportunity to craft its own distinct legislation. So instead of just adhering to the minimum age for marriage and all, it created its own legislation, and the result was the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance. So the MFLO gives economic and legal protection to women by regulating marriage and divorce and restraining polygamy. Marriages actually have to be registered. Divorces have to be registered. This is huge. Somebody earlier, I'm not quite sure who, it might have been Tom, it might have been you, or somebody earlier had said, well, there's no birth certificates and it was Tom. There's no birth certificates and there's no death certificates in Afghanistan. While that's true in rural Pakistan, there's an increasing number of marriage certificates that exist and divorce certificates that exist because of the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance. The MFLO requires registration of all marriages, the written permission of a man's wife or wives to be presented before an arbitration council to decide if the man may marry again. Now, of course, sometimes that's not adhered to properly. She's, coerced into doing it, but at least the law exists, right? I mean, that's a step forward. The abolition of divorce by simple repudiation has been disallowed. Talaq, it used to be that a husband could just say to his wife 3 times, talaq, 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 I divorce you, and it was done. Now you actually have to go through formal legal proceedings if you want to have a divorce. And other safeguards for women in the event of divorce. Safeguards regarding maintenance of children, maintenance of the wife, and the giving of the haq mer, the promissory note that's given at marriage, and in the event of a divorce, it has to be paid now. So with the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance, for the first time, the Pakistani state guaranteed women's rights in the country through codified state safeguards. Women activists were so jubilant following the passage of this legislation that they're said to have showered Ayub Khan's car with rose petals when he came to Karachi. Remember, he was a military leader, dictator, but this was something that was high on his agenda. Where has this led? Well, the next major legislation affecting women's legal rights in Pakistan was in its 3rd constitution that I talked about this morning, the 1973 Constitution. It's hard to depict it. I thought you might like to see, a postage stamp of it. The 1973 Constitution further advanced women's legal rights in the country on a number of fronts. It affirms in the section on fundamental rights and principles that the state is committed to eliminating exploitation. Article 25(1) guarantees that all citizens are equal under the law and are entitled to equal protection of law. Article 25(2) adds, quote, there shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex alone. People don't realize that is explicitly in Pakistan's 1973 Constitution. There shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex alone. Article 27 prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, race, religion, or caste for government employment. Finally, Article 34 in the Principles of Policy section state, quote, steps shall be taken to ensure full participation of women in all spheres of national life. Remember, this is 1973, long before CEDAW. And Article 38A adds that it's the responsibility of the state to, quote, secure the well-being of the people, irrespective of sex, caste, creed, or race, by raising their standard of living. A sociologist's paradise, right? But, however, only 6 years later, Only 6 years later, Zia-ul-Haq promulgated his controversial Islamization program that I talked about a bit this morning. It resulted in previously unimagined effects on women's personal and professional lives. It fostered an unprecedented controversy, as the state never initiated a public consensus on what that would mean, and it superseded the constitutionally mandated Council of Islamic Ideology, which had been tasked to do just that. The Hudud ordinances that I talked about this morning, heralded as the foundation of this new system, but it was essentially just a new penal code, focused on enforcing punishments for distinct types of crimes explicitly outlined in Sharia, such as theft of private property, I mentioned these this morning, theft of private property, the consumption of intoxicants, and adultery and fornication. As I said before, the most heated controversy concerned the latter, zina, both because the ordinance governing it made no legal distinction between adultery and rape, and because its enforcement was indeed discriminatory against women. A woman needed to have 4 sallah male witnesses. Sallah means religious, pious, above question, their reputation's above question. They had to come in and support the woman and say that they saw that this was indeed a rape and not an act of adultery. Well, what 4 righteous men would allow a rape to take place? If they were witnessing it. So, to begin with, the whole issue of evidence of zina was very controversial. And as I mentioned also, the law of evidence, which critics had charged would disallow women from testifying at all in certain kinds of cases and would cause their testimony in other cases to be irrelevant unless corroborated by another woman. This broke new legal ground in Pakistan because, as I mentioned this morning, it clearly gives men and women different legal rights and at the least underscores that the state did not regard women and men as equal economic actors. There were many protests against this, especially by elite educated women, trying to make a mass movement, but it was harder. And it's harder because of the kinds of patriarchal relations that exist in rural areas, that exist in many parts of the country. But here's a 1982 protest in Lahore by Women's Action Forum members against the Hudud ordinances. And at the top of the priority list was always that you just can't have a law, zina, that imprisons women if they are the victim of a rape. So it was not until the 1990s, though, that Pakistan began to turn its attention back to the issue of women's rights. I was talking to somebody earlier in the day. There's one article that I wrote, came out 1989 in Asian Survey. It's the one thing that I've written that I disallow. I was wrong. It was called Benazir Bhutto and the Future of Women in Pakistan. And everybody believed that when Benazir would become prime minister, everything was going to change. I did interviews with women in the old city of Lahore who told me, my husband will stop beating me when Benazir comes to power, because presumably there would be jobs. Everybody expected laws to be passed. Nothing happened, right? So there was a lot of frustration over the fact that whether it was Benazir in power or Nawaz Sharif in power, both the PPP and the PMLN gave a lot of, they talked a lot about women's rights, but did they actually pass legislation? Did they actually change policies? It was negligible. But in the late 1990s, Pakistan began to turn its attention back to the issue of women's rights. And a lot of that had to do with what was happening in the global community at that time. Indeed, much of what was done was in its external actions, such as becoming a states party to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990, signing on to both the 1993 Vienna Declaration, which recognized women's rights as human rights, the 1994 Cairo Population Development Conference's Program of Action, and then the 1995 Platform for Action at the Fourth World Conference for Women in Beijing. So when did women's rights re-enter the legal spotlight in Pakistan? And you may have thought I was being a bit light on Pervez Musharraf this morning, but there's a reason for it if you take a gendered perspective on this. Because neither Benazir Bhutto nor Nawaz Sharif's government, despite numerous promises, ever actually passed legislation to promote women's rights, nor took action to reverse some of the legislation passed by Zia-ul-Haq, which had negatively impacted these rights. It was instead during another military government, this time under Pervez Musharraf, that the state again turned its attention to considering various strategies and priorities to promote women's rights in Pakistan. Let's reflect for a moment, though, on why. Ayub Khan's vision, remember I talked about the golden age of development, 1958 to 1968. Ayub Khan's vision was to modernize Pakistan, especially in promoting economic development and the rid of the state, providing women with immutable rights that we see in the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance, especially in the arenas of marriage, divorce, inheritance, and custody. It was essential to promoting this transformation. But Zia-ul-Haq symbolically moved Pakistan closer to the Middle East. It wasn't in prioritizing Sharia, but rather in prioritizing laws and practices that had not actually been a part of Muslim traditions in this area. Women historically have had greater agency here. And you can see it by the fact that they went out on the streets to protest, right? So women historically have had greater agency here. Even Hanafi fiqh, Hanafi jurisprudence, ensures this more than does Hanbali and its Wahhabi derivative does in Arabia. But in the state's quest to find a basis of legitimacy for itself, it ignored the unreasonableness to tread on the legal rights of women. But why do we see then Musharraf's government set about to rectify the legal discrimination women were now subject to in Pakistan, reinstate reserved seats to encourage the political participation of women? Neither Benazir nor Nawaz Sharif did that. And draft new legislation to promote women's rights that had been continued under the present administration of Asif Zardari. In many ways, Musharraf's goals were quite similar to Ayub Khan's, to promote growth and development in Pakistan. But we must not lose sight of the reality that this was being now done in a very different global context. First is what we have learned as a global community. No nation can move forward and prosper without bringing its women along in the process. Educated women tend to have smaller, healthier families, and they make economic, political, and socially productive contributions to their countries. Second, the pervasive globalization of the economy limits the influence a given country, like Pakistan, can have in asserting itself in external economic negotiations. So the more a local economy can strengthen itself, the better its prospects when it looks outward. And nothing can have such an impact as incorporating qualified women into the mix. Finally, however, there is a last consideration. In the wake of events of September 11th, 2001, the Pakistan state was given a clear message. Are you part of this global community or not? Now, it's interesting that there are many arenas where Musharraf's government could have instead focused its attention on bringing Pakistan into the community of nations. Instead, it prioritized setting in motion a series of reforms to promote women's rights, consistent with globalized norms articulated in the CEDAW Convention. Musharraf's promotion of women's rights thus can be seen as an effort more to improve Pakistan's standing in the international community than to improve women's legal standing in Pakistan. Within Pakistan, as I mentioned before, different constituencies are deeply divided over what constitutes accepted roles and rights of women. Did Musharraf provoke further divisions in reviving reserved parliamentary seats for women, in revising the Hudud laws, which resulted in the Protection of Women Act, and finally submitting and successfully defending Pakistan's CEDAW report before the UN Division for the Advancement of Women in the spring of 2007. I'll defer from elaborating on the details of the various initiatives Musharraf's government undertook. I mentioned that report that I've written on this. You're certainly welcome, to go. It's all online, so you can access it. But I want to note that it often used language that resembles the requirement. Whoops, fell off the dupatta. 1 second. Sorry. And I should mention, though, it was under Benazir Bhutto's government that Pakistan signed on January of 1996, shortly before the second time she was deposed for corruption. Pakistan's government did sign on to become a states party to CEDAW. Nothing was done. Absolutely nothing, because I kept on checking vigorously, frequently, and no movement had been made forward to actually write the required reports that you have to write for CEDAW. There were drafts that were done, and they were embarrassments, basically. But finally, it was under Musharraf's government that they finally submitted, and they were able to successfully defend Pakistan's CEDAW report in spring of 2007, just a little over 5 years ago. As I was saying when the microphone fell, that in all the various initiatives that Musharraf had used, that Musharraf's government undertook, it often used language that resembles the requirements of CEDAW. That used the language such as the terminology of creating enabling conditions, which makes it obvious that the government of Pakistan's concerns were more with its reputation within the international diplomatic community than necessarily with promoting substantive transformations domestically. However, I do want to point out that while traditional views towards women's roles in society were being championed in some domains, especially by Islamist political parties and their supporters, substantive changes had already been occurring throughout the country over the past 2 decades in social practices, social orientations, and values. Conflicting images regarding the place and power of women were having widespread social, economic, and political consequences. While Pakistan did not condone discrimination against women at the constitutional level, I just read you some of those clauses, how could it now set about and develop specific and articulate, workable, acceptable laws, since there were so many different views among stakeholders? The Hudud laws were now coming under increased international condemnation and were included in many reports on worldwide human rights violations. That being raped in Pakistan could itself be a crime did more to hurt Pakistan's global image than anything else. Musharraf's government set about to pass laws to rectify this poor image, including the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2004, popularly referred to as the honor killing law, which made an honor killing, killing a woman who shamed her family, it was murder. It was finally, legally, simply an act of murder. And this was followed by passage of the Protection of Women Act that placed the crimes of rape and adultery back into Pakistan's penal code. And that's when, it wasn't that the Hudud ordinances were repealed, it's that the Zina Act, having anything to do with adultery, was taken out of Hudud and put back into the penal code. So, was this an accomplishment? I think so. I mean, the act of being raped was finally no longer a crime in Pakistan. The Protection of Women Act was the culmination of the women's rights activism that had begun shortly after Zia had introduced his Islamization program in February 1979. Reform of the Hudud laws had been set in motion when Pakistan became party to the CEDAW Convention in 1996, pledging to review existing laws and social institutions to eliminate discrimination against women. But little was done until Musharraf's government revived the issue of women's empowerment as a key component of its policies to promote Pakistan's progress. In all, Musharraf's quotas for government seats amounted to 5% for women in government service, which has since, by the time of the end of his tenure, it was up to 10%, 17% for women in national and provincial parliaments, and 33% for women in most tiers of local government. It formalized the National Commission on the Status of Women, sought national consensus on a national policy on women, and set in motion a series of reforms to promote women's rights consistent with global norms articulated in the CEDAW Convention. We should not be surprised to see Musharraf acting to promote these reforms. He was never affiliated with Islamist political groups and therefore never particularly supported their agendas. Moreover, he consistently supported more liberal causes such as environmental sustainability, human development, and promoting education for all Pakistanis, though it didn't quite work out the way people had hoped it would. However, one more factor must be considered as well: the timing of the reforms. The global community was exerting great pressure on Musharraf to crack down on extremist political groups in late January of 2002. By Musharraf taking this important stand promoting women's rights just over a month later, he was further eroding the social influence of Islamist political groups as well, or at least that's what he was trying to do. It's poignant to note that the greatest opponent to the Protection of Women Bill 2006, and this is the Dawn newspaper headline saying that there was some respite for women at last, but the greatest opponent was the Jamaat-e-Islam, the same group that had led the opposition to the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance in 1961. The Jamaat-e-Islam lodged an immediate outcry against the reforms, charging that the Hudud ordinances were a viable Islamic document and that the reforms, quote, would encourage adultery in society and would further increase obscenity, vulgarity, and Western culture in Pakistan, end quote. Ultimately, Musharraf, as Ayub Khan had done 50 years previously, Musharraf prevailed and the bill became law in November of 2006. Now, the current Pakistan People's Party administration that came into power in February of 2008, it's continued the process of promoting women's rights through legal reforms, and the same groups voicing opposition to the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance continue to oppose the new legislation. Many of the reforms are clearly counter to what the majority of Islamist political groups argue is necessary to secure women's rights. The latter's emphasis instead tends to be on reinforcing traditional norms of propriety and female subservience, and that anything more may expose them to ideas that are shirk, forbidden, prohibited, and be disruptive for households and the wider community. But important recent legal initiatives include a National Domestic Violence Act and addressing sexual harassment at the workplace. Soon after coming to power in February 2008, the PPP government declared that it would promulgate a National Domestic Violence Act and address sexual harassment at the workplace. Women's rights activists were heartened when the National Assembly passed the Domestic Violence Prevention and Protection Bill in 2009, but were soon dismayed that the Senate in Pakistan didn't take up the bill for discussion in a timely manner, and they allowed it to expire. Nearly 3 years later, in February 2012, Senator Niloufar Bakhtiar, a woman, reintroduced the identical bill, now termed the Domestic Violence Act of 2012, and it passed with support from all political parties represented in the upper house, including the Jamiat-e-Ulama-e-Islam, which had earlier deferred the initial bill in the Senate that had caused it to lapse. Now, the 28 clauses of the bill that I'm talking about, against violence against women, these are quite comprehensive. They state that domestic violence includes all intentional acts of gender-based or other physical or physiological abuse committed by an accused against women, children, or other vulnerable persons with whom the accused person is or has been in a domestic relationship. To add, however, what I want to say is to add some teeth to the bill, the clauses outline specific financial and penal penalties for committing acts of abuse, some of which are defined as assault in the Pakistan Penal Code. A second initiative unanimously passed in the National Assembly in January of 2010 is protection against harassment for women at the workplace. You can see Zardari right here signing this historic bill. And it makes provisions for the protection against sexual harassment of women in public space. Not just at the workplace, but just, walking down a street, walking through a garden, any type of public space. While concerned with women, importantly, this legislation is not restricted to women. It requires all public and private organizations to establish an internal code of conduct at the workplace and complaint appeal mechanisms aimed at establishing a safe working environment free of intimidation and abuse for all employees. It includes penalties as well for management if management does not institute this code of conduct, because the management of a company, even if they're not the owners of a company, those individuals can be prosecuted and fined. The accompanying amendment to Pakistan's Penal Code importantly recognizes that sexual harassment occurs everywhere and at all times in Pakistan. Indeed, this amendment to the Penal Code signals a societal shift on thinking about sexual harassment because legal assurances and penalties for breaking the law now exist, which can support awareness campaigns about sexual harassment and educate women that they now have the right to prosecute this kind of discrimination and persecution. Now, two additional recent bills, both modifying the Pakistan Penal Code and the Code of Criminal Procedure, have pushed the legal empowerment of women in Pakistan further. Passed in December 2011, the first finally rectifies the abandonment of the Anti-Women Practices Bill in 2009 that I mentioned before by listing specific punishable offenses against compelling women to marry, especially, quote, in consideration of settling a civic dispute or criminal liability, including wani and swada, as well as depriving women from inheriting property or facilitating women marrying the Quran or other anti-women practices. So in this slide, you see a picture of Asma Jahangir, a well-known Pakistani human rights lawyer, giving an interview after passage of the Anti-Women Practices Bill. And this is a poster that became prominent in Pakistan, noting that the Anti-Women Practices Bill has outlawed marriage to the Quran with a penalty of 3 to 7 years in prison or a $6,000 fine. And marriage to the Quran was a practice, not that common, but it happened, where a woman would never actually be married, that they said, oh, she's so pious, she's so religious, we're just going to marry her to the Quran and then forget about her. Swada is a practice, and it was very interesting to see these strange bedfellows in the Northwest Frontier Province aligned with women's rights groups all against Swada. It's the handing over of a young girl to settle a dispute when, let's say, a murder had taken place. So the family of the murderer gave the family of the murdered man a 6-7-year-old girl. She would be raised in their household. She would marry a male member of the family after she achieved puberty. And the idea in traditional Pashtun society is that this would be a very visible symbol of alliances that were made between these between the two families. But indeed, her life became a living hell because she was a constant reminder that somebody from her family had killed a member of their family. Wani is related to it, karo kari, exchange marriages. There's a lot of traditional practices, and this Anti-Women Practices Bill has outlawed them. So, but I said that there was a second bill, commonly referred to as the acid-throwing legislation that was also passed in December of 2011, just last December, that specifically cites penalties for causing harm or disfigurement by using a corrosive substance punishable by long imprisonment and fines up to 1 million rupees. What happened with this acid throwing, and it still happens even though at least now it's it's specifically against the law, is if a man wanted to marry a woman and either she or her family said no, somebody from his family would throw acid in her face, because if he couldn't marry her, nobody would marry her. A final act of legislation promises to make perhaps the greatest difference of all to affect women's rights and empower them in the future, and that's the elevation of the National Commission on the Status of Women last winter. Importantly, and this is their website, just thought I'd show that up there. Importantly, the NCSW has been granted greater administrative autonomy to review laws, make recommendations to Parliament, liaise actually with provincial governments, and overall gain greater scope, funding, and impact on redressing violations of women's rights. Yet, there's more to be done. In June of 2011, Chief Justice Iftikhar Muhammad Chaudhry singled out the need to address child marriages and challenged the Law and Justice Commission to suggest amendments, quote, to check the practice of offering girls and women in marriage to settle feuds between two tribes on the intervention of jirgas and panchayats. The possible amendments would introduce stringent punitive action to prevent women from being forced into marriage, quote, in exchange for money because of extreme poverty, or for settling disputes, that's Vani, or the use of girls as compensation for crimes, swada, that I just explained. Interestingly, such practices have been criticized by both Islamist political groups and by women's rights groups for some time, the former on the basis that this is an anti-Islamic practice, and the latter on the basis of it being a human rights abuse. But just this past month, within the last 2 weeks, a young girl was given in Swada, despite passage of the legislation, right? A young girl was forcibly given in marriage. A young girl was given in Swada in Swat, and a 7-year-old girl in southern Punjab was forcibly given in marriage in Wani, in retribution for a kidnapping perpetuated by one of her cousins. However, that the anti-women practices legislation now exists gave those girls' families more ammunition to fight the tribal jirgas that had passed these judgments, which is why I know about them, right? Because it was written up in the news, but what gave it fuel was because that legislation exists. Needless to say, if Chaudhry's recommendations become law, this would certainly forward the legal standing of females in Pakistan. Drafting new legislation to ensure women's economic rights and opportunities to earn an income will certainly be controversial, as the issues of women's mobility and economic self-sufficiency remain highly contested social terrains. Women's economic participation in Pakistan is among the lowest in the world for a variety of reasons. I learned firsthand many of the challenges confronting poor women in Pakistan to earn an income and help feed their families when I conducted field research 2 decades ago for my book, Walls Within Walls, which chronicled the lives of working women in the old city of Lahore. These women taught me then that many of them had to work within their homes, hiding the fact that they earned money doing piecework because local mores would condemn their husbands if others came to know they were living off the labor of their wives' hands. The use of social marketing to disseminate awareness of new laws is needed, both to the public and to the judiciary to enforce those laws. There's a dire need for public information campaigns informing women of their rights under the new legislation that's been passed. The subordinate judiciary judges must be made aware that the new legislation exists affecting women's rights in Pakistan. I've been surprised to read just how many of them don't know anything about it. These legal reforms must also be a separate mandatory topic at the Federal Judiciary Academy, so all new judges are aware of them. But there's a final arena that clamors to be mentioned here, notably the social costs of militarism and how the extensive violence and destruction that Pakistan has been experiencing is foundational to any discussion of ensuring and forwarding women's rights. It threatens to undermine state policies concerned with eliminating discrimination against women and the small gains made thus far in empowering women, as well as its polarizing the country. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and other militant groups are exerting pressure on the government of Pakistan to compromise on women's rights in return for political accommodations. A very real concern is that there are few people able and willing to champion the cause of women's rights in Pakistan today and who are in a position to pressure the federal government not to capitulate to such irredentist demands. It's one thing for states to pass laws to promote women's rights. The true test of commitment to rectifying inequities and injustice comes with implementation of those laws. Pakistan is navigating that first phase with mixed results. While women are no longer at risk of being charged with a crime for being raped, and efforts are underway to ensure women can travel to and be employed at workplaces without risk of major harassment, terrorists continued to attack girls' schools and seek to limit women's actions and rights in very violent ways. And the Federal Shariat Court recently declared 4 sections of the Protection of Women Act un-Islamic, and therefore those 4 sections are unconstitutional. So in conclusion, we have to find ways to bring together advocates of Pakistan's 2 somewhat conciliatory political enterprises. 2 somewhat contradictory political enterprises, those prioritizing global rights for women and those advocating a closer adherence to Islamic precepts, to find accommodations that will benefit not only women in the country, but bring together Pakistanis in a consensus that has eluded the nation thus far. The Muslim Family Laws Ordinance was such an accommodation 51 years ago. The challenge is to find such an accommodation today. The difference is that with large numbers of educated women, working women, politically engaged women, Pakistan's women will most certainly continue to move forward. Thank you. And they have my prompt.